All right. Wow. That was
And
2, 3, 4.
Peter, there was some question as to whether we wanted to go ahead with having a meeting. I did want to come back and keep on pressing on this issue of basically having the same status that neighborhood associations have in terms of recommendations to developers to go to the neighborhood associations, also the recommendation of developers to come before us as well when they're getting into Enron areas. And Pete, you provided us with the code, and I don't think anything in there is as specific to this.
No, the part of the code, the NROD code deals strictly with the standards of the overlay district rather than the procedures.
Right.
So the procedures section of the code is chapter 1750, which pertains to land use decisions, and it requires a pre-application conference and contact with the applicable neighborhood association, and provides the details for how an applicant goes about doing that. And that's in furtherance of goal 1, citizen involvement in land use planning. It's a statewide planning goal. Most cities do it via their citizen involvement committee and their neighborhood associations. So the statewide planning goal in that regard is met through the CIC and the neighborhood association. So we want to add this to the agenda.
Well, I think we need to set that as whether we do it in terms of having it as a change in that part of the code.
Okay.
And we have discussed that, and I don't know if those discussions at this point have gone to Laura Turway, who's the director.
Right.
I think she knows about that interest on our part.
Yeah, I spoke to her about it. This is item 5A, and we can incorporate that into the discussion. I was planning to talk about it.
We should have gone through the steps and I called to order. My apologies. I was just jumping down on the business that we had. Let's go ahead and start at the beginning again. Sure.
Oh, make sure your mic light is on. I
did hit.
I did not.
What do you want me to do?
A call to order. And
Yep.
I guess I'm asking you
If I'm here.
essentially a roll call, but that's not even on here. It is in Parks and Rec. Agenda analysis. There's only the one item that's specifically called out here. And, there's 2 items actually. The natural resource overlay district, but I think that's related to this 5A.
Mm-hmm.
Old business, we have no old business coming up in the new business discussion. So I've called this to order. Is there anything that anybody wants to bring forward on the agenda specifically? And maybe this is the point where you might mention a possibility.
Sure. Like to maybe talk about something Dorothy was wanting to do in another venue, a river tour that we could make happen very, very cost effectively for us in Prague. I guess that she's a member of, and you're a member, I didn't know that she was. So we can add that to the agenda when you get there.
No, she's a member of our group, not of Prague.
Oh, she's not a member of Prague?
No.
Oh, okay, well, if we want to involve Prague, we'd be happy to do that too. I suppose I didn't want to get into discussion right now. You want me to just put it on the agenda for new business?
Well, yeah, what I'm suggesting that we go ahead and
Discuss it?
We'll go ahead with this, and we can go ahead and put that as an agenda item under new business after we have this discussion.
Okay,
Okay?
all right, good.
Anything else somebody wants to cover specifically today, as opposed to putting it on a subsequent agenda?
I'm going to add that item into the agenda
Okay.
on the machine here. River tour with Parks and Rec, with Prac. Okay. And,
Oh, I guess I'd wonder if you'd want to discuss compensatory mitigation. No? I'd like to know what that word means. Does that mean required? Or does that mean?
You know, it means that you are unable to mitigate on the site. So you acquire new land to compensate
Okay,
for the change.
okay.
that
All right, thanks
Was
for,
agreed.
thanks for,
Yeah.
all right,
Hey,
okay.
so that was agenda analysis.
Okay, so now we're back into the new business section here. The process that I guess perhaps what we ought to focus a little bit is goals, and I don't know without having established a goal of having what I'm asking to happen needs to go through a goal or goal setting session
Yeah,
of
so
ourselves.
I'll just let you know, we're currently about to start the public hearing process for code amendments. And we've got a lot of code amendments proposed because of the equitable housing project. And we're also amending the procedures, the administration procedures section of the city code, the zoning code, 1750, wherein during public hearings, we'll be reviewing code amendments and anybody can suggest for the Planning Commission's consideration and recommendation to the City Commission changes. The normal process is to go through us as staff and then we'll, come up with a recommendation. So with respect to the current procedures for notification of the Natural Resources Committee, we provide notice of land use actions and then specifically natural resource overlay district applications, which may or may not be combined with other land use applications, or a type 2 land use review in most cases. And in some cases, they require type 3 or public hearing because they're associated with either a variance or an adjustment to the criteria in the Natural Resources Code or some other variance criteria in a separate part of the Development Code. And our policy as a city is when you have combined applications, the application that has the highest level of review governs all the other applications. So if you would normally have something simple like dividing a lot in half, which would be a type 2 review, but it requires a variance and a natural resource application, then you have a type 3 situation. My first question to the Natural Resources Committee was, what does the committee hope to gain from early interaction with a proposed developer within a natural resources overlay district? And then I was going to talk about what staff talked about as some of the concerns we had about that, and just share that with you, and then we can talk about it going forward.
Well, I mean, for example, I presume it's the type 3 requests that the developers are asked to go to the neighborhood associations about, or do they do it for type 2s as well?
In the code, it applies to all land use applications unless specifically listed. So the types of things that are typically required to go to the neighborhood association are annexations, subdivisions, master plans, zone changes, variances.
Well, variances do as well.
Yeah, variances. Anything that would normally trigger a quasi-judicial hearing would have to go to a neighborhood association. And by quasi-judicial, that means something where you're judging the application based on not just the code criteria, but it's also its compliance on more subjective criteria like the comprehensive plan, which has more aspirational criteria. So in most cases, our code is clear and objective, and we have to have that. And we also have to provide an opportunity for an applicant to have a discretionary or a quasi-judicial review, which is what a type 3 is. And that requires a public hearing and a different set of notifications because it has to be put in the paper. And the timing, whether you're a type 2 or type 3 or a type 4, you're still subject to what's called the 120-day land use decision deadline, which means once the city deems an application complete for processing, that starts the beginning of a 120-day decision deadline by which we have to either approve, deny, or approve with conditions. And the applicant controls that deadline. And if the city is coming up to the end of that deadline, then the city has to ask the applicant to extend it, which is usually in the applicant's best interest, because staying within the land use process defined by the city is much more predictable for an applicant than getting booted out of the land use process and going to a court to ask for a decision. That never happens. So most of the time, if the 120-day process, you come up to the end and the applicant wouldn't grant us an extension. So that does happen. Mostly it happens because of appeals. And the appeal will require that you would keep extending the 120-day deadline until you've issued that appeal decision at the city commission level. Yeah. So I'm going a bit off topic on that.
Oh, no, the process is what I'm trying to get into.
Yeah, sure.
And in that 120-day period, for example, when a developer, the only things we'd be seeing would be those that involve Enron classifications. So not everything a neighborhood association would want to see would necessarily be something that we would need to see at all.
Right. Right, exactly. And I think, if there's something that's deviating and proposed to be adjusted from the specific code in the Natural Resources Overlay District, then that's going to go to the Planning Commission. I should mention that. And the Planning Commission has a lot more discretion than staff does, and can add specific conditions of approval if they don't feel a criterion has been fully mitigated or something like that. So in those situations, it would be potentially worthwhile for the Natural Resources Committee to weigh in on the adequacy of the mitigation, for example. And I don't disagree with that. So I think what staff is feeling like is there's a possibility that this is an appropriate thing for a type 3 review, but not necessarily for a type 2 review because of the need to have a clear and objective standard. And there's nothing in a type 2 process that compels.
Is your mic on too?
Yeah, sorry,
Okay.
I'll get closer. There's nothing through the type 2 process that can compel an applicant to do more than the minimum. I guess that's the simplest way to put it. If they meet the code and our Natural Resources consultant agrees that they've met the code, because we have the consultant check what the applicant's report says to make sure that it's adequate from a professional biology perspective or ecology perspective, then that decision can be issued at a type 2 staff level. It can be appealed to the city commission if somebody commented during the public comment period, which is a 14-day public comment period. And so the difficulty I think we've discussed before is the timing associated with this, and the fact that you as individuals could comment and appeal on an application, but as a group, you would have to meet and have a quorum if you were going to make some kind of decision, pro or con, about an application. So what precedes that whole 120-day process is a pre-application. And the period between the pre-application and the formal application is usually the time when the applicant meets with a neighborhood association. And I believe what Doug, you alluded to, and others, was that that would be an opportunity for the NRC
Right.
to meet early and.
Yes.
Yeah. So, yeah, that's kind of our take on it, but we're open to a further discussion. Yeah.
Well, the question is, do you think the community development department is interested in pursuing this? I mean,
I think if it, to be candid, Doug, I don't believe this recommendation is going to come from staff.
No, but,
Yeah.
so that recommendation would have to go through the city commission directly, is
Yeah.
what you're saying,
Or to the planning commission and then on.
or
to
the planning commission.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I know you would, we could flesh the idea out in more detail and write
Right.
some criteria.
Well, my concern was
Yeah.
to make that recommendation
Yeah.
and staff doesn't agree with it.
Right.
And that, I mean, that'd be pretty kind of disturbing.
There's a couple of other things here is that, we've got several advisory committees that have a similar role. They have a particular subject area which they're expert at, PrAC, for example. And they are not a decision-making body. They are an advisory body.
Yeah, well, that's what we are.
Yeah, and if the opportunity is extended to one committee to provide input on a land use application because it affects natural resources, why shouldn't another committee such as PrAC have say on a development that's say within 150 feet of a park or something like that? But I don't know. Those are the kinds of things that
Well, I don't know.
really, I don't know.
I don't know if that's completely comparable. We're just talking about
Natural
natural resources overlays.
Yeah, but we're talking about impacts as well, and impacts on what are ostensibly public goods and public resources and parks, So, yeah. I think if it were, from a timing perspective, doing it within the 120-day process is problematic because on the one hand,
No, I'm.
yeah, doing it outside of the 120-day process is much less problematic. Yeah. And that's because we haven't explored the idea in much more detail than that to come up with a proposal other than say this isn't a requirement of a developer. And so it would be a fairly simple code fix, but what I'm getting direction on is that we don't really want to pursue it at this point because of the other ramifications for other communities as well. But
Like I said, I'm not sure that I understand the concern.
well,
I mean,
yeah.
Can someone explain really what's going on here? I'm sorry.
Well-
I missed the last meeting, so.
Oh, okay.
I guess the concern is, number one, listen, Parks and Recreation is not under the planning department.
Yeah,
We are.
I get it.
So, I mean, on many levels, I don't see that's a big issue.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, to be
our recommendations could go directly to the planning commission where they're seeing these things. They don't have to go to the city commission.
Yeah, I mean, to be perfectly fair to you and the rest of the committee, I mean, like any other policy recommendation, we would write what the pros and cons are. So, and be completely transparent about it. And then it'd be in writing, and the planning commission make a decision about it, and a recommendation, so.
I mean,
And
given what we're basically charged with,
right,
if we don't have input at the development stage, I'm not sure what our function is.
Well, you're certainly involved in the creation of policy and changes to policy. So there's that aspect to it. But when it comes to actual development applications, I'm seeing, that's what you're talking about.
But we're also talking about making the recommendations to the planning commission as well, so
Right.
it's not.
All right. So I feel, I'm a bit of a messenger here, but, I'm open to further work and suggestions.
I guess my request would be to have the planning director.
Have it discussed.
Come
Yeah.
and meet with us on this
Well,
issue.
we have a work session on Monday for the remainder, for all the other code. And that would be a good opportunity to raise this issue on Monday.
And-
Yeah. And
Okay.
then we'll have further work session on Monday. So that's the 13th. And then we have another work session on the 27th.
You have specific items on the work session, but can you fit that in okay?
The code is, the length of these amendments is so big that this will be a drop in the bucket compared to it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that
They're dealing with the equitable housing stuff and a lot of other things.
principally equitable housing, but also some code related to process.
Correct.
1750, the administration procedures section. Nothing's really changing. It's just consolidating procedures.
Well-
Yeah. Other than that.
The city commission's work sessions, generally they do not invite public comment. But we're going in as one of the advisory committees. Would we be given the opportunity to speak if it's a work session?
My experience in the last 6 months is that the planning commission is open to public comment at the work sessions.
Okay.
Yeah. And if they aren't, that's fine. We'll bring it forward as staff as well. As a discussion item.
The public comment is probably going to be mostly directed to what they have before them and how do we introduce a new piece? That's my question.
Yeah, I agree. Well, you would just initiate it via an email and you can make a decision about that tonight. So I guess so you're basically making a recommendation to this evening that you would like to see that incorporated into Chapter 1750
Yes.
as a procedure. And that would form the basis of whatever motion you care to make this evening.
Here's the thing, I don't want to go before in a work session and say that
Yeah.
if doing so has has no support from the staff in the process. I mean, I don't think it's going to go anywhere. And I guess rather than dealing with it at this point of the game,
Well,
where you have so many items that you're already dealing with in code amendments and so on, especially on the equitable housing piece, that there should be a mechanism at a subsequent planning workshop, be it to actually talk about it at that point. And because I think, I'm not following the planning commission, but I think they're so focused on this. I saw what the work session advisory vote was. It was a 3-3. There were only 3 people there. And then one person changed his vote in terms of whether it applied to just the concept areas versus
yeah.
the whole city.
Yeah.
And I think they're going to be so focused on the discussion of that just bringing in this new piece will get kind of short shrift. I guess I don't want part and parcel of what's going on right now because there's so much on their plate in which they're dealing with. And I really would like the opportunity to talk to the planning director and make sure the whole idea is not getting nixed in the process.
Okay, fair enough.
Because if we come up with something that hasn't been before them, and the planning director doesn't support it, I don't think it's going to go anywhere.
I think what we really need to tie this to is what is the purpose of this meeting, this additional time spent on the part of the developer, if and when the criteria are there in the code and the applicant can meet them. So that's really what would potentially compel a change in the process, if there's an opportunity to. I mean, the reason that they, even with, for example, taking the CIC and the neighborhood association into account, they will have questions that are outside the realm of the code. They may say, we really want you to make sure that these buildings look a certain way, or we want you to, you know.
But our focus is only on the Enron.
I know. But what I'm trying to say is that there are clear and objective standards for all of this. And that's what we are bound by law to follow. So, but that said, the early involvement piece of it is really tied to citizen involvement in that sense, rather than, you know, the quality of the application is from a natural resources perspective. But yeah, I could definitely see a situation where you guys have a unique suggestion and a developer could potentially implement that above and beyond the code. And if that is the stated objective, then...
I guess my request is the same thing.
Yeah.
Let's not talk about the next two work sessions. They've got too much on their plate, and I don't think, even when we made the suggestion, I just don't think they'd be paid much attention to, simply because they've got too much on their plate. And the time, I'm not concerned whether we do it in this current year or we do it with the new commission coming on. We could do it next year. Oh. I would really like to have a discussion among us and our planning director.
Right. Well, I know that there are other things that we're talking about as far as adding wetlands into the overlay district that aren't within the current scope of work. So, yeah, there would be certainly another opportunity to get at this.
Now, when you say you bring in a consultant specifically dealing with the Enron areas?
David Evans and Associates, we have a contract with them to assure that when there's a wetland delineation proposed, that the impact on the buffer of the wetland or a Title III perennial stream meets the code and the plant spacing and all of that stuff. So they check the adequacy of the findings in the staff report. And if they add recommendations for conditions of approval if they think they're necessary. Yeah. So that principally they're looking at the adequacy, the mitigation and monitoring plan for any area that's replanted.
We want to put in the form of a request to have the planning director meet with us in the form of a formal motion, which I don't think is really necessary. No. But if you feel it's necessary, then...
No, I just wanted to make sure that it was on...
Yeah.
That there was that communication with Laura.
I just don't want you to always be the messenger. We had problems very early on in the old days where you were going between and things kind of...
No,
I don't want to put ourselves in that position.
I don't want to be in that position.
But I find, Laura has a different personality and so on. And so I don't anticipate anything will be kind of confrontational in the process, which ended up being the case when the first Natural Resource Committee came into being.
Yeah. And, I understand where you're going.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think we have a greater ability to influence good design and adjustments by developers when they come to us, the college, the Cove, probably 5 this last year that have come and talked to us, I think. compare it to going to commission meetings, which I've been there, I've seen you doing your duty and so forth, where you got to talk to the criteria, but nobody's telling you what the criteria is ahead of time. You got to figure it out.
Yeah,
so you're kind of in a pickle because you can't speak your heart,
Right.
which is what people really want to do. They have to only speak to the criteria, whereas we are in a role of hearing the attitude about something and whether we want it to be adjusted in a different direction. I think when Randy Tyler and Ed Darrow were involved, I think it's probably still the same, are willing to, and they will come to us again, Lloyd Hill, and they're looking for our support and also our input. That's really important.
Well,
We can have an impact.
I think what I didn't say, Doug, is that, I think we can make recommendations to developers that they should come to you early when they have a pre-application conference and say what the role of the Natural Resources Committee is, and that you're experts in your field and that you have good points of view and you understand what the project is about. You would like to understand any ramifications of what's proposed, and you can make suggestions. And bigger projects are going to take advantage of that, as you just suggested.
I have a question.
Pardon?
I have a question.
Yeah.
How many pre-application meetings do the developers show up with blueprints and plans already on the paper?
Very few. If they do, they usually say this is at a 30% design stage or something like that. And if it's not at that level, it's usually very conceptual and may not even have, vertical elevations drawn yet, more like just two-dimensional footprint type sketches. Yeah.
Well, that's certainly good. I feel like the sooner our involvement in an NROD situation would be, the better it would be for the developer.
Yeah. Yeah, the basic prerequisite submittal items for a pre-application are a site plan. And if they're at that level, if they're doing site plan and design review for a non-residential project, we do ask for initial elevations, which is how tall is the building going to be, that kind of thing. And then at the pre-application, the engineer and the public works engineers are there, one or two, and then the planner who's assigned to that pre-application. And then however many people the applicant wishes to bring along in terms of their consultants, or in some cases it's just a couple of people, and in other cases like the Cove, they have a room full of consultants that are at the pre-application. So, And the pre-application conferences are a written summary of customized, suggestions as to how to prepare the application.
And that's where we want to see it.
Yeah.
At that point.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
I wonder how many of us have been involved in that. I've been involved in 3. It's very interesting process.
Yeah, I mean,
one with you and our trail issues.
Yeah.
Another one, a small project up here, and something else with protection of Mount Hood Creek, High School Creek.
Sorry, doesn't have official name.
Well, it goes down to J.Q. Adams. It's a very interesting process.
Yeah, I mean, it's the whole intent of that process is so that the city understands what's being proposed and the applicant understands what the regulations are and how long it's going to take to get through the process, and the costs for review, and also the costs for system development charges and other things that are adopted. And then based on that information, they prepare a formal application within 6 months and then submit that. But most cities have a process like this in place. So that's the procedures part that we wanted to talk about, but I was also going to talk about the proposed code amendment ideas that we had for the natural resource overlay district, when you're ready to talk about it.
Okay?
Okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
And so you're going to come on the screen or?
Yeah.
Okay.
It is, sorry. In front of you, in the packet, is the entire Natural Resources Code.
Light reading.
The only pages that you really need to pay attention to, I've given you the entire code so that you know every part of it. What we've discovered after, about eight or 9 years working with this code is that certain situations come up where it's not super clear how to process certain things. And for that reason, we have suggested a couple of small amendments that we wanted to discuss with you. And these have not been put up on the city website yet, and they haven't been up before.
Are these the things that are bringing forward on the screen, on this document here?
Yeah, and it's on the screen. So the basic setup of the Natural Resources Code is you have a section that talks about the purpose, and then you have
Switch over.
then you have a list of prohibited uses, then you have a list of exempt uses. By exempt uses, that means that they don't have to go through a formal process in order to be done. And then you have a set of regulated uses, which requires land use review. So the list of prohibited uses is proposed to change. That's in chapter 1749070. And that allows, that prohibits certain things. So any new lots that have buildable areas within the NROD, dumping, grading in a certain amount, etc. So basically it says that anything else is either going to be exempted, and these are very specific things, or required to go through review. So the types of things that are not required to go through review are enhancement projects authorized by the city, farming and farm uses as defined under state law, utility service where there's a single utility pole, surveys which have limited impact on native plants, soil investigations, and all of these uses, if they're intended to be small and low impact. Trails that are narrow and made of pervious surfaces that meet these criteria are exempt from review. And then as long as you locate your development entirely out of an NROD area, you don't have to go through review, obviously. So you can look at the city's natural resources overlay map, see where the line is, and locate your development outside of that, because that line is pretty conservative and bigger than what it would need to be.
Yes, I know.
Yeah.
And when the NROD has not been defined, like the Kanema issues, remember the whole thing?
Oh, yeah. So there's specific language in the code that specifies when a buffer attaches to wetland. And the city's got this adopted layer, and it's based on a map. And it says that the map can be adjusted only by the city commission. And it also says that the buffer only applies to wetlands that are within or touching the existing inventory. So if a wetland partially touches if a new wetland is found that partially touches the overlay comes around it to protect it and apply a buffer to it. But if discover a wetland that's wholly separated, then you might have to comply with state lands and Corps of Engineers criteria, and that wetland has to be protected, but it doesn't get a buffer associated with it. That's the difference. So by incorporating new wetlands into the adopted map, we adopt a buffer as well. And the buffer is 50 feet for wetlands. And if it's a stream, it all depends on how steep the slope is next to it. So it can be from 50 up to 200 feet, depending on if it's an anadromous fish-bearing stream. So that's the mapping part of it. What we're specifically asking you guys to look at tonight was, we do get the question from homeowners who have pre-existing homes.
This printed thing we have do not contain the amendment.
Yes, it does. On page, starting on page 6.
Okay, very good.
Sorry. Under exempt use K. So measures that are, the old language says, measures mandated by the City of Oregon City to remove or abate nuisances or hazardous conditions. That's the old language, and it didn't really specify what a hazardous condition was in the case of a tree. So what we're proposing is that if a tree falls under the definition of a hazardous or diseased tree or imminent hazard tree, which is already defined in the city code, then after that hazard tree has been removed, any disturbed native vegetation shall be replanted with similar vegetation found on our native plant list pursuant to the mitigation standards of this section. And that's usually a square foot calculation with a certain amount of ground cover and seed mix and shrubs and trees associated with it. And so that's actually what we have been using as policy, and this just helps further define it.
Oh, this is not confined to NROD. This is any.
This section is strictly applying that NROD mitigation criteria to that situation.
All right.
Yeah. And then the other thing under L, we wanted to expand our, what am I trying to say here? Allow people to plant native vegetation that's on a regionally adopted plant list or is recommended by a professional or an environmental professional. Since being limited to our existing native plant list, which hasn't been updated in a while, which is something we should really put on our work plan.
Because I think Oregon City's native plant list is essentially Portland's, is it not?
It hasn't been updated as recently as Portland.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that would expand that. The other thing which we wanted to provide more specificity about was whether or not fences should be allowed to be placed within a natural resources overlay. And if so, under what conditions? And the assumption here by staff is that the impact of fences on the natural resources overlay is ostensibly fairly small. However, it might not be, which is it could potentially block passage of wildlife or streams or impact wetlands. So for that reason, we said if this is going to be an exempted use, then the criteria need to follow something fairly clear. And this is what we suggested. First, the fence would have to meet the fence standards in terms of height. And then rather than trying to gauge what the impact of the vertical footprint of a fence is, just require that a strip on either side of the fence be planted with native species to cover any bare ground. And then provide 6 inches of clearance from the ground level, and then require.
What can't get through there that we'd be concerned about?
Yeah, that's what I was wondering about too.
Deer
and elk.
Deer, if they wanted to, probably could jump what they've got there. Is it
Well, there's two ways to go with this. This is something that, we can discuss whether or not it's appropriate to have a 6-foot privacy fence in an NROD area. And whether.
Well, I think the notion of having something that animals can get under is a good idea.
Yeah.
That's a great, again.
It wouldn't have to be continuous.
No.
We used to check and make sure the highway department put caps in all the Jersey barrier.
Right.
I noticed the last time I was back home, they weren't doing it anymore.
Yeah.
I was pretty disappointed.
Yeah. I mean, there's more than just small animals that we need to think about.
But here, this would be for the whole fence length anyway, is it? Or
Yeah, I mean, what we've been dealing with in certain situations is where somebody's backyard fence has fallen down and they want to replace it. And it's allowed to be a 6-foot fence all the way around the backyard, but corner of that property has a buffer area or a stream in it in the case of Kenema, because some of the houses in Kenema are right over the streams.
yeah.
Yeah, in the basement.
Right. And in those situations, it's coming out from under the foundation of the house and then it's running into the yard. And they want to be able to have that privacy fence and it basically crosses that stream. So that's what we're trying to get some specific language on. And whether that should be exempt, we feel that it should be, but other people, feel that it should be a type 2 review and require an impact analysis and mitigation. But it's such a small thing that if you have decent criteria that requires that they replant and it's not impacting the top of the bank or the wetland, then I think this is a reasonable idea. But we wanted to get your opinion about it.
And item 4, and outside the delineated wetlands, that doesn't necessarily mean outside the buffer area, though.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
That's fine.
And this is a very rough first draft. It would go to the planning commission at the second work session in
Can we go back to Kay for just a second? I have a question about the hazard tree and the disease tree. You find those kind of things in natural areas all the time. So does this, do you still require a 20-inch tree to have 7 trees in replacement in this case, or does mitigation?
When we're cross-referencing here to 1749-180.
Okay.
So when we scroll down to that, it offers 2 options. So I'm going to go down to 1749.
Sorry, he'll go back.
Mitigation standards in 1749-180. There are parts of this that are not going to apply, but there are parts that would. If you went with option 1, and if your fence required trees be removed, then this table would tell you how many trees and shrubs to replant. If you did not have to remove any trees and you were basically looking at the impact from a square foot perspective, you would go with planting option 2, which requires native trees and shrubs planted at a rate of 5 trees and 25 shrubs for every 500 square feet of disturbance area. And then it gets into more detail about bare ground must be planted or seeded with native grasses or herbs. Non-native sterile wheatgrass may also be planted or seeded in equal or lesser proportion to native grasses or herbs. And then there's some specificity for the size of plants. In this case, the trees do not have to be like 2-inch caliper. They can be,
Do not have to be?
no, they can be, sorry, I'm going to scroll up and see this. I think 1/2 inch. Plant size, yeah. So under option 1, replacement trees shall be at least a 1/2 inch caliper on average, measured 6 inches above the ground level. So that would be the size requirement for the tree planting.
The thing I'm getting at, I guess, is a lot of the situations in natural resource areas are dynamic and fragile and all the above. And if they start evaluating the condition of trees, as you would in a strip of trees along the right of way or something, it seems a little excessive. But you could have come across a nuisance tree, I'm sure.
I mean, it's
But disease is good. It brings in bugs.
Yeah,
Bugs
but-
bring in birds.
Yeah, I think there's a point. Is there a requirement that within the wetland they would remove a diseased tree?
It's not required.
Okay.
That's kind of why we've taken the language that says mandated
Yeah.
and replaced it with the word approved.
Yeah, because I think Jerry is right. I mean, it's a natural process.
Right.
And a diseased tree falling down is going to provide habitat, and as it says, its decay will feed various, flora and.
That's a good question. I actually had that question yesterday because we had the same situation from a tree company, and the homeowner had a tree that was otherwise healthy, but leaning towards the house, and it was 15 feet from the house. And we said, well, we need an arborist report that says that tree's a hazard even if it's healthy. And they were happy to provide that. And then the tree company arborist called us and asked, did we have any regulation requiring the debris stay on the property or under the canopy? And there's nothing in the code about that. So that means they could, haul it off, or if they wanted to, or they could leave it.
I think you have two guys. I mean, eventually trees die, and
Yeah.
if they die, and they're going to get diseases, and if it's a disease that come in and spread havoc all over the place because it's a disease that the ecosystem hasn't seen before, it's one thing. But if it's something that's natural to the area, and it's in the delineated wetland, not in the necessarily the buffer area.
Well, the most likely tree you're going to see in Oregon City in a situation like that is a short-lived tree called big-leaf maple.
Yep, big old
And,
maple. That's what it was.
That is, without a doubt, the most likely tree you're going to get a call on, for example, in Kanema.
Yeah.
Probably the first most likely is black cottonwood. Or maybe
Alder number 2.
Yeah, alder's right up there, so.
Yeah.
There's a lot of old big leaf maples I can think of, but that's okay.
So the issue is
The biggest black-leaf cottonwood.
because the tree isn't hazardous, it's on a person's. It's on a person's property, and they do not feel it's going to be hazardous to them, and it's in the wetland. I don't know if we should prescribe at all that they need to deal with it.
Well, there's also snags for raptors, and
Absolutely.
Yeah.
woodpeckers and all that good stuff.
We amended
Of
the
which-
tree ordinance to protect stands and assemblages, I believe, and gave some precedence to that, I think.
It
As
should
long
be
as it's not
flexible
gonna
if
fall
it
on
can.
somebody's house or something, I could
Well,
understand
that's
why
not-
you move it in that
exactly
case.
right.
But if
That's
it's
true.
not a danger,
And that's a hazardous tree.
right,
Right.
right.
That's a
But
hazardous
if it's not a
tree.
danger to,
Right.
Yeah, if it's
Their
not,
personal
it's not,
property like
maybe
that.
even if it's in the buffer area, if the person doesn't want to remove it, then,
Oh, yeah, we don't want to have to require that if it's not a hazard. And that's basically why we're saying that the burden is on the homeowner to prove that that tree's a hazard if they want to remove it. And that's where the arborist report comes in.
Well, just a hypothetical, someone has a tough shed that they'd like to integrate in a setting, an Oregon setting, on public property. I'm being very specific. There are coast pines there in that area that has a natural resource overlay corridor, very poor one, but right in it. Okay, so they're in that corridor. They have shifted over time because soils are wet, but those things grow in coastal dunes and all that. Somebody wants to put a tough shed there and wants to remove these 20-inch trees. And it seems to me there ought to be a process to think about, why don't you put your tough shed somewhere else, maybe? Or is there some other way to cable them and give them some strength, you know, or thin them to allow them to remain there because the area has a serious screening need. I'm fighting this debate right now at the Enfield Trail, where we've been putting in all this buffering trees. And I'm thinking, is the tough shed that important? Let's put it over here instead of remove the screen that's so
arborist
needed.
says, can the target be moved? So the arborist said, look at the target, can the target be moved is a part of their analysis as to whether there's a hazard or not.
There is no target there yet, but if you put a target there, then you'll have a target.
yeah, no, but what he's pointing out, if you're gonna,
Yeah.
It's okay.
Well, yeah. The other consideration is, does the tree have to be removed if it could just be pruned and remove some of
Yeah.
the weight from the canopy, you know? And,
Then made
Yeah.
more resistant, cable to its neighbor, you know, to give some strength, things like that.
and none of that is in the code, you know?
Yeah.
There's no sort of half measure here. It's either.
I don't even think that's in your tree code. I don't think cabling and other
No.
methods are.
You're right.
They should always be encouraged if they can be made to work. If we could have done that with the Abernathy Almond time, case in point,
Yeah.
we didn't quite make it.
Yeah.
let's come to K here and talk about a little bit more detail. This includes the removal of any tree determined to be hazardous or diseased. Who's making that determination?
So when you look at the definitions that I put on your, in front of you.
Code, according to the code.
Yeah.
Arborist report.
Yeah, when you look at the definition, it requires that it be a certified arborist report. So,
If they're going to the wetland and they say, well, that's a diseased tree, and that doesn't mean it has to be removed. That's the big question. I mean, if the arborist identifies a tree as being a diseased tree, does that mean they're going to have to remove it?
no,
Okay.
That would be good.
This is the wording in here.
Okay.
This includes the removal of any tree determined to be hazardous or diseased. That does not mean it has to be removed.
okay, so you want to be clearer about that. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, those make sense.
This
In hazardous, I remember an issue about 10 years ago, falling limbs may injure beavers. Remember that?
Yeah.
With a bunch of trees along the corridor near Sportcraft and so forth. So hazardous is in eye of the beholder, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, once the beaver is chewed into and it's about to fall down, he's made it a hazardous tree.
But that's good, it's creating habitat.
So
So I think what we would add is the city may permit the removal of any tree.
yeah, it almost sounds like it's mandated. And I don't know, what we're saying is it probably shouldn't be that way.
Yeah, okay, so,
But maybe you need to deal with hazardous and disease separately in that regard. Because if in fact it's hazardous, and hazardous to, I'm going to assume to property and human life, then then that tree should probably be removed, as opposed to a tree that's going through a natural process, and it's going to die and it's going to fall, but it's not going to affect any property, and probably no human.
Oh, so yeah, making a distinction between just a diseased tree and a hazardous tree. Yeah, okay, so if that were the case, we would probably need to amend the definition
Of hazardous and disease.
because it includes both in the same definition
Yeah.
and separate it out as a separate definition.
I suggested, when's the timeline on this?
We have until November.
Okay, so you can look at our concerns and do some editing and
That's a really good
and
point.
share it with staff there and then come back to us.
Yeah,
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Good idea.
okay, all right.
Well, you actually don't have that many changes, really, do you?
No.
Probably 1 or 2% of the whole thing.
These are the two issues that have come up again and again and again, is fences and trees. So,
Fences are sticky.
Well, depends what they're made of.
Western red cedar.
Well, I mean, sticky. Western cedar isn't sticky, is it?
okay, so that makes sense. So,
Never mind.
Grand fir is really sticky.
He's not in a good humor, or my humor isn't good one.
I'm not falling. I'm just getting human.
A sticky tree.
that's good directions.
Okay, so have we seen all the edits at this point?
That's everything that
Okay,
we've,
I guess it's let's just look at it one more time.
sure.
Yeah.
So, the comment regarding K is to differentiate between a hazardous tree and a diseased tree, because a diseased tree doesn't necessarily have to be removed and it has ecological value.
Yeah.
And the hazardous tree probably does have to be removed, but the city is not going to require it. It's going to permit it
Right.
if we have an arborist report that states that it is a hazardous tree. Then,
And I guess if the diseased tree dies, there's no obligation under the property owner to plant other trees. I mean, it's just gone through a natural process.
That's why I asked the question about the number of trees.
That's a good
Based on
question. I mean, if we make the
size or
distinction
placement.
between one versus the other, then I think we have to state clearly that no mitigation is required in the case of a tree.
Because, I mean, if it's a natural process and presumably the tree's going to naturally be replaced by something else.
If it's in a natural area, it should be replaced by something
A
else
natural
coming in.
process.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think sticking maybe the hazardous tree on this piece, that you're actually removing a tree that still might have had life in it.
Every tree is going to become diseased and die.
Yes.
Except redwoods and
Well,
Briscoe
there you
pines.
go, there you go. They're just going to burn up. I won't say that, but I'll say that.
Okay. And then L,
Okay.
adding the language.
Yeah, I think I'm glad to see your other regionally adopted plant list is a good idea.
Yep.
Yeah.
You could call out metros or
Yeah, we were wondering whether we should call them out by name or not.
Metro's got a ton of stuff.
Because regionally adopted, somebody could,
Yeah. I
You know,
think-
the entire state of
I don't know-
Oregon versus
I don't
the
know if
Portland
you-
metropolitan
I
area.
don't know if you have to call it out because you recognize Metro's list.
I don't know,
So I don't know.
regionally, maybe
Other
locally.
regionally adopted plant list would include Metro in its own right, so I don't know if we really have to call it out as an example.
Maybe more locally adopted,
I like.
because regionally could be, you know, we're a huge region. The state of Oregon could be,
That's a good point.
We could
so if
give
it was
it,
locally adopted, it
we
could be
could-
Metro or
Yeah,
Portland
yeah,
or.
yeah, I think it's a better idea.
Metro, Portland? We could just write.
Yeah, for example.
Yeah, it's fine.
And I think the language, the term adopted is important because
Yeah.
it differentiates between something that's been vetted through a public process as opposed to just the Sunset Garden book or something like it, which is perfectly fine. But
Right.
Well, adapted is actually a botanical term.
oh, it's saying adopted.
Right.
When you,
But I hope there's no confusion there.
I don't think so.
okay.
Adopted,
Okay, that's good.
that's what it is.
With what? What do you mean?
Nanking cherry is
Oh, okay.
adapted. Black cherry's adapted.
Bang cherries are deaf. Right?
And then,
Pink cherries were
what's the feeling about the fences?
Okay, we're gonna look at the fences.
Yeah, let's look at the
We're
fences.
gonna look at the fences again, guys.
Okay, sorry. Sorry.
Okay. Compliance with fence standards, and whatever those standards are.
They're principally a height limit,
Now,
but they do allow
I think the tallest fences that you allow are 6 feet, aren't they?
6 feet unless you go through a land use process. So,
Right. And frontage is 4 feet?
3.5 feet for anything in front of a residential house.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, you might have a commercial property where but that would be subject to the same height limit. And they would have to go through site plan and design review to ask for something higher.
2 feet on both sides of the fence shall be planted or seeded with native grasses, shrubs, herbs, or trees to cover any bare ground.
pretty unenforceable. But number 2, item number 2. How you gonna enforce that? And I know it's
Well, on the one hand, you're correct there because we don't require a permit for a fence.
I mean, there's a lot of things in our code that nobody enforces unless somebody complains about it. And
That's true.
That's basically what it boils down to. I mean, if you get upset and you see it and you call in.
complaint driven.
Yeah, it's complaint.
Yes,
Yeah.
6 inches of clearance, I like that, the 6 inches of clearance from the ground level. So if they can jump over 6 feet or they can go under 6 inches, the wildlife can get in there.
The moms and dads can jump over, but the youngins can't.
Yeah. Fence post should be, let's hope mom and dad come back. Fence post shall be placed outside the top of the bank, upstreams, and outside the delineated wetlands.
The idea here is, yeah, I mean, you can imagine somebody digs a hole and then they pour a concrete footer and put a concrete post in there, and that's in the top of bank of a stream, then that's potentially a big impact.
Yes.
Especially when the condition of the corridor is already marginal. So, it's.
Now, all of these are within, everything we're seeing here is within the delineated area and not necessarily the buffer?
Everything would be within the adopted NROD boundary, which includes the buffer.
Okay. But you
Yeah.
said the fence itself, which is specifically,
In the case of the fence post.
yeah, it's outside the delineated wetlands.
Yeah, so the
Okay.
fence post has to be outside of the delineated edge, and then there can be other fence posts placed within the buffer. Yeah. It has to meet all of those.
Yeah. On one level, I share Jerry's concerned about the the specificity on numbers planted versus the diamond and so forth, those things removed. But the mitigation can occur in other areas, right?
Only if you're going through a land use process. This is an exemption. So this basically says, you've got to do this. You don't need a permit, but this is the standard. It's like everything else on this list, for example, trails. Yeah.
Let's come then within that area. And I don't know how you're going to deal with this in code, so maybe it's just so difficult to deal with. Person removes a tree,
Yeah.
require that they plant so many, let's say it's of such a caliber that they're going to have to plant so many other trees. But what if the canopy is so thick anyway that those trees aren't going to survive?
Well, if they're going through a land use process, they can propose an alternative mitigation plan, and it's a type 2, but it has to be a professional report that says, for example, the canopy is so thick here that it doesn't make sense to plant it this spacing that's mandated under the clear and objective standard. But, yeah, and they could propose an alternative
Which is they're
spacing.
paying some money to have somebody make that determination.
Correct.
But there are trees that come up through the.
Oh, no, I understand that. No, I know that. I know that.
Yeah.
Including Doug Fir.
Yeah, and we've seen that for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Western red cedar as well.
Yeah. Hemlock as well.
Yeah, so that's something that's going to require some discretion.
Mm-hmm.
The idea here is that there is no discretion and it's enforceable through the code enforcement process.
So. So there's nothing we can do to this code to specify the actual alternative.
Well,
That actually directs.
there is a section of this code that says that, these are, let's go to the top here, sorry. Following uses are allowed within the NROD and do not require the issuance of an NROD permit. But there's another part of the code that says, generally speaking, everything's a type 2 review unless exempted. And that's a separate part of the code. But this is all about education. The average homeowner doesn't necessarily know they have a natural resources overlay district in the backyard. And so getting a brochure put together that says, you are in an NROD area, here are the regulations, is really the other part of the equation here, rather than just having the regulation.
I guess I'm a proponent for the committee. Person it's not a land use thing. The person has a delineated wetland and has a buffer zone, is going to cut down a tree, but he's going to have to hire somebody to come in to see, does it make sense to actually have that much planting? Or that person, rather than paying out money, where that person could come to this committee and demonstrate in fact that it's not necessary to do that much planting.
That'd be fine.
I'm answering the question.
And the,
Because, you have things that might be perfectly reasonable, but you have to hire a professional at some cost to you to say it's reasonable.
And sometimes you can't hardly get anybody to respond for a small job.
Well, yeah, but
I'm trying to get a well driller to come and look down my well, but they're busy.
yeah. But my point is that an easier, cheaper alternative might be nice, but I think it's a bit problematic to do that in the code. But if you have some discussion about this specific focus here, where we're talking about.
Well, there's several ways that you can potentially get more specific and provide guidance where you just do it based on square foot impact and says, you shall plant from this list at these amounts for any impact. which is basically telling them what to do as opposed to them presenting a plan of their own.
Like the idea of having a broader list of plants to plant because that adds biodiversity. Whereas if you have 5 trees and 20 shrubs.
They could all be the same.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I'm thinking the footprint, well, it all depends on the footprint and the disturbance as well.
I think what I'm suggesting is just too arduous, but, we're dealing with the same thing when we're talking about getting heritage trees designated, and they've got to pay a professional to go through that process. And what you've created is a hurdle.
Right.
And this is a little bit different in that you're not trying to encourage somebody to protect a tree, you're trying to deal with a tree that's going to be done away with, but
I see. So I think maybe what's problematic as far as K goes is the very last piece of the sentence, is this pursuant to the mitigation standards. If we just ended the sentence after the word list, that wouldn't imply that they have to put together a very complicated mitigation report, which may be perfectly adequate.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I could think of some other things that could be in that wording. I'm willing to work on this thing a little bit, but K talks about other things that can be replanted. It could also include retaining of the down woody material to provide for habitat values. Could be an approach that could be taken when trees have to be removed. There's a bunch of things you could add in there that reflect more of the natural area approach. Tree falls, limbs and everything else get left on site, and actually assembled in some manner to create some value.
It depends on the property. I mean,
Yeah.
not everybody wants a brush pile for small birds and mammals in their backyard. I wish they did,
Yeah.
but I know they don't.
And if they're going to put a fence up, then you'd never know whether they kept the brush pile or not. So,
So,
yeah, I agree with you.
I think-
But a lot of people don't want brush piles in their
Just
yard.
suggesting a more
You're thinking out loud, yeah.
natural approach
yeah.
where we can suggest it. And I also like the idea of people coming to us to present their case and us making some suggestions to them. I like that. That's what I heard you saying,
That's what I was, that's what I suggested.
because I think people react to that. Well, I think they're looking for us for some leadership.
Yeah.
And this group's got a lot of capability.
Nothing we would put forward would have any mandate associated with it, of
No,
course.
voluntary thing,
If you're doing a pamphlet, could you put at the bottom that citizens with questions are welcome to come to this
Yeah,
committee?
Sure, put it on our website.
Yeah.
Website could mention
Yeah.
that, yeah.
I'm not going to write the code yet. I'm just going to write a note.
I'll play around a little bit with K, just do my rudimentary method and send it to Pete. And he can send it out to everybody else. How's that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Add language to suggest as opposed to require.
Oh, suggest.
Yeah.
Suggest.
Okay. But otherwise, there's not that many changes in this document. Am I wrong?
Yeah, that doesn't look like it.
No, looks pretty good.
Contact.
I guess I'm going to ask one last question. I probably don't want to get off this, but in the case of Kanema, the whole debate there was the natural resource overlay area hadn't been, delineated? Is that what I'm going to say?
Well, he did delineate.
They did delineate.
Well,
but
the
it wasn't-
wetland was delineated by DSL.
Yeah, it was
Well,
delineated, but.
he delineated it and he turned it into DSL and they agreed with it.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, is there anything in here that encourages that kind of expansion, deliberation, consideration?
Yeah, there is. Well, I'll show you what is on the books now, which
Okay.
is part of what the consternation is with respect to the buffer not applying.
Yeah. Even if you buffer everything, there's nothing.
Well, it's true.
I'm telling you.
It is.
Well, I've been through
So
that.
there's more than one section. If this section says that addition of wetlands to map following adoption, NROD boundary shall be expanded to include a wetland identified during the course of a development permit review if it is within or partially within the mapped NROD boundary and meets the state of Oregon definition for a locally significant wetland. So it has to be both mapped and meet the locally significant wetland test. In those cases, the entire wetland and the required vegetated corridor defined in this code shall be regulated, and then that is considered part of the official NROD. Then down here, you've got consistency and relationship to other regulations, and this is where it talks about in B, the requirements of this chapter apply only to areas within the NROD and to locally significant wetlands that may be added pursuant to what we just said. If in the course of development review, evidence suggests that a property outside the NROD may contain a wetland or other protected water resource, provisions of this chapter shall not be applied to that development review. However, the omission shall not excuse the applicant from satisfying any state or federal wetland requirement which are otherwise applicable. Those requirements apply in addition to and apart from the requirements for the city. So that basically says that those, and the state doesn't require a buffer, they only regulate the wet part.
Yeah. And,
Yeah.
I mean, I think we have buffers as small as 15 feet, don't we?
For intermittent streams.
For intermittent streams, so I don't think all of Kootenai is would be covered by buffers necessarily. So,
It is almost covered entirely by geologic hazard overlay.
yeah, that's true, that's true. Yes, that's true.
And that's partly why, because of the slope, partly why the NROD boundary is so big, because the NROD boundary
Yes,
only applies from the point where a slope starts to level out and everything else is all in it. So, yeah.
It's a mess.
Okay, all right.
Okay, let me save that. Important to save.
Now would be a good time to have your wetlands delineated.
To have the what?
Your wetlands delineated if you were looking for small ones.
Yeah.
So.
There's a really hot dry.
Yellow jackets. Probably full of yellow jackets.
Well, that was, okay, where are we on the agenda? Keeps logging me out. Okay, new business. So then you wanted to talk about the river tour?
yes. Jerry?
Sure. I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this. There's been a group meeting for about a year now, trying to, matter of fact, I think Bill, you were involved when we first tried to put this together, to look at opportunities to solve some issues along the banks of the Clackamas in Oregon City and also the Lamp corridor. And what we were looking at in particular was what Gladstone has been able to do with other people's money. They've gotten a lot of improvements to 35 acres of area called Meldrum Slough and another about acre of land in Meldrum Bar Park where a log revetment caved into the river. It's all been restored now. Steel's out of the water. Habitat's been built. Doll Beach, which is right across the tip of Clackamas Park, and then a little farther up by the 1990 bridge. There's about $30 million worth of improvements that have happened there, or will, when they're all done, be done. Clackamas River Basin Council created about 5 acres of mitigation sites of enhanced wetlands, with other people's money, okay? It wasn't always Lower Harbor Trust Fund, but it was in a mitigation banking sales system, which Bill knows more about probably than I do. But the issue was, could we do this in Oregon City? So we came to Oregon City with this idea about a year ago and took it to Tony and your manager and also John Lewis. Ed Doro and I brought the idea forward, the developer of the code, for their consideration, and brought in a wetlands consultant, John Runyon, who we've had speak here before us. And that got the ball at least rolling in people's minds. It's a very complicated thing to understand, but it really comes down to if somebody else has a need to solve their problems on their industrial or other lands, and they can't solve them totally, are they willing to invest in other areas of wildlife habitat enhancement and development? And there's a lot of sites that Gladstone have that are really suitable around Meldrum Slough and Meldrum Park, but it turns out that Clackamas Cove is suitable and is a site that would have value. And there's areas along the corridor from Clackamas Park all the way to the Legacy Project areas that we were suggesting. And all those areas are now getting some consideration. And the city, I think I'm saying this right, commission has adopted an attitude that they want to pursue this idea. Now, what you just said, compensatory required or compensatory mitigation being done on somebody else's land, not your primary land, may go away. I hope that isn't the case too soon, because this is kind of built around that idea. But so we had a boat tour or some method, a van tour, hopefully would come together. And what's come together now is on the 11th, which is this Saturday, August, and the 18th at 9 a.m. until 11, there's a total of 12 people each time that can go on this tour. I didn't open it up to this group because originally it was for the managers of the city and people like that, and city commissioners and candidates for office. And I should say that I'm doing this cooperatively with the Oregon City Business Alliance because I want their buy-in on environmental work. That's really something I want to see, and they're getting with it. They're really behind it. They're helping pay for the use of the vessel. Vessel costs $200, $100 an hour. 2-hour cruise could be as much as $200. But what I've been seeing is most cruises, they're charging $100, even if you're out there 2 hours. So I tested this thing a couple times for the Historical Society, took them on a tour. I've piloted vessels all my life, although with my eyesight, you want to be careful, okay? So, I mean, I'm very careful, very careful. All right, so the result is in a 2-hour span, we could do a tour from John Storm Park down to and including Mary Ash Young State Park and look at the mitigation sites in Gladstone. We could look at proposed sites that City of Westland would like to see in this portfolio of improvements. Cedar Oaks Island, I should say. And then we could proceed upriver past John Storm Park, where we started, all the way to Falls, looking at areas that are suitable. I can't, at this point, add any more people to the 2 days because we're full. Dee Dee, one of our members, purchased this boat thing or got it donated for the Parks Foundation, so there's no cost, and she really wants to do a tour, bad. And I said I'd be glad to help in any way I can, and I think it'd be a neat thing for us to do this, before October. October, the river gets too fast, and the 7-mile or 8-mile-an-hour vessel is going to Portland, and it ain't coming back. If you see what I'm saying, with the current. So we should do this in the fall. I would propose that we consider it, and if there's a cost, I'd like to talk to you, Pete, about how we can proceed. I don't know.
I have no power over the budget.
Right.
That's something that goes directly to Laura. So
I think Dee Dee and I are willing to work on this, is what it comes down to, but I don't want to see this group not have an opportunity, because I think, forget the mitigation site, just the beauty of the river in the fall, I think you'd enjoy it. And this is so quiet. I mean, I've never been in anything so quiet except the sailboat. You can't even hear the electric motor. It's pretty amazing. So there's 2 vessels that are owned by people here in Oregon City. They're at Burrard's Landing, which is opposite the courthouse. Where the courthouse is, just opposite is in Westland, Burrard's Landing. They bring them down to John Storm Park, and then give you the keys and tell you, go ahead, and tell you to stay in the middle of the river. Well, there's a few other things I'm looking for besides the middle of the river. So if this group has an interest, I'll pursue it with Dee Dee.
Well, I'm sure there's an
There would be no cost to us necessarily.
Yeah, I'm sure there's an, well, to us, where's the money going to come from?
Well, at this point, she got this vessel as a donation, I think, to the Parks Foundation. My thinking might be is if we and some members of the Park Foundation did it together, there's how many of us? 7 of us, if we all went, and Pete, of course, 8. Roger might want to go Fowler, and I don't know. We'd have to, or we could do 2 evolutions.
Yeah, because
We
you
should take care of both
you have
groups.
the foundation, and you have the Parks and Recreation Advisory Committee, and you have ourselves.
Well, I didn't include Pratt, but you're right. That's
Well,
good point.
the reason I say that, I think ultimately most of the, a good portion of the Clackamas River publicly owned lands that Oregon City owns will, and as well as the Cove land that's going to be in the public domain, will
Right.
probably revert to Parks and Recreation, parks anyway.
Probably.
Yeah.
So if you'd like us to pursue it, I think there was some confusion initially. I think she thought it was open to everybody on this committee, but it was not. That was not the intention. It was the people on the mitigation study group, which have been meeting for about a year.
I guess if there's no cost, then there's not a issue if you're going to look at planning department to actually pay for some services there, then there is an issue. It may not be an issue, but it's something that we have to explore.
I had proposed a bus tour. This is better. Bus tour aid cheap, about that. Because he helped us cover the expenses of the bus tour about, 5 years ago when David Frazier was still there, I believe. That was a $400 item, I think.
Well, if you could make
I'd be willing to look into it.
yeah, if you could determine what the cost might be and then
Sure.
explore it.
Okay.
Yeah,
And then discuss it in detail at our next meeting?
Right.
Have a proposal for the group?
right.
Okay. But include Pratt, Parks Foundation, and us, is that, okay?
Yeah,
That would be a couple boatloads, so
yeah, it would be.
12 at a time,
Yeah.
yeah, okay.
Okay. Okay. Great.
With that, it appears that we're coming into communications.
I'm done.
You're done? All right. Anything to communicate?
Oh, yeah, I'd like to apologize for my confusion on the July meeting. I was camping, escaping the,
What kind of deal is that?
for some reason I thought June and July both were
No,
canceled.
what you should have said, you were trying to look for the opportunity to actually call in, and you were at a place that you couldn't find a phone, so you weren't able to do so.
Well, it's Decatur where there is no phone service.
Well, that would have been true. The north side of Green Peter Reservoir.
Do you have anything to communicate?
No, other than I should apologize too, but I was dealing with a student who decided that he didn't want to work with me and frantically trying to find a replacement and ended up getting my 15-year-old grandson to replace the almost 21-year-old, and he did a much better job.
Good deal.
So we finished this week, so.
I don't really have anything to do with this minute. It's not a communication. We'll come to future agenda items and in a moment, and I do have something for that. Do you have anything on communications from yourself?
Yeah, I just wanted to let you guys and the public know that as far as the code amendment process, we have added a series of open houses and planning commission work sessions to the prior schedule to accommodate more input from both the public and the planning commission on this set of code amendments because it's so large. The August, okay, one moment. I August 13th is the first evidentiary public hearing with the Planning Commission. That will be preceded by an open house from 5 to 6:45.
Okay. The agenda, I mention the work session, but I don't. The work session starts at 7 though.
Well, because we have a noticed public hearing already, and then we added a work session, we have to hold so we're going to hold the public hearing, take testimony from any public who's
But
present
that'll still all start at 7.
at 7.
Okay.
yeah. And then
open
adjourn
house
to a work
proceeds.
session.
Okay.
It's a little unusual because of that, but it was requested by the Planning Commission. Then on the next meeting after that is an open house and a work session on August the 20th. The open house would be again from 5 to 6:45 p.m. and the work session at 7 p.m.
Now, regarding the next open house, is it similar to the open house they had at the last meeting?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, we have the same posters. We're actually using the same posters from the previous meeting so that we can see what the prior input with the sticky dots and the comments were, and just adding on to that. There may be some additional posters or amended posters to reflect the most recent set of amendments that is before the Planning Commission, but very few changes. The next meeting is August 27th, and again, a work session. That would be the 5th work session with the Planning Commission, followed by a second public hearing on August 27th. And then after that, we have 2 Planning Commission hearings scheduled, September 10th and September 24th, if needed. And then we will have a work session with the City Commission. The date of the City Commission work session will not be September 11th. It would be September 5th. And that's going to change on the website because there's a ceremony for September 11th on that night. And then we are anticipating at least 3 City Commission hearings, which takes us into November. So there is further opportunity to talk about things that we talked about this evening. Great, thanks. I don't have any other news to share with you for now.
All right. On the future agenda items, there's been discussion, a fair amount of discussion at the Greater Oregon City Watershed Council of trying to find a way to engage communities in the naming of streams that are not named in Oregon City. Now, most of the streams have names, but they're not official names. And I'd like to entertain the possibility of us finding out, number one, what would be required in this process from the state, but also then having a mechanism of engaging neighborhood associations in a process of recommending names for streams. And I think the city has to be involved in that particular process, and I think maybe the way to introduce this is through this committee. I don't know what the state requires, and I don't know if anybody on your staff knows what the state requires.
It's a USGS.
USGS, first stream, all will go through USGS.
Yeah, pretty sure.
Okay.
Not positive. I know mountains are,
Uh-huh.
and I'm pretty sure streams are because they have that old water network and everything.
So maybe the USGS needs to be approached and consulted with.
So that's a future agenda I would like to put forward.
Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting thing because at some point in the future, we're going to be updating the comprehensive plan. And what makes it onto the Goal 5 resources inventory and be open for suggestions again.
Several, I know you've seen the signs that the Greater Oregon City Watershed Council has made, and Public Works has at no cost to the Oregon City Natural Resource Committee has installed those
Very
signs.
nice. How many are there?
13 altogether. One of them is actually outside the city, and the the county put it up because apparently the person that's responsible to them owed our one of our public works, the operations manager, a favor. So we got that one done too. That one's, but yeah, there's a total of 13 signs up.
Oh, wow, neat. Very nice.
And
Was that a Metro Enhancement grant or what was it?
no, it was we have a grant that comes in for for what they call it's an enhancement grant, but it can be used for educational purposes. And we clarified with them that having signage for signs, signage for streams was an educational process. So there's money that we did that wasn't specific to the job, but that we could use for it.
Yeah.
And we came up with a list of names of the streams we wanted to have that put on, and all of those streams got on the list. And so there's somewhere that stream that we had on our list is covered.
And they're under the auspices of a education government type sign, so they're exempt from the sign code, which is important. I can't remember the last time we had the joint PrAC meeting, but is that coming up in our future?
Especially given their, I'm a member of PrAC, and I'll just mention, I think most people know Public Works has now procured property in the industrial area off of First Street for the expansion of their Public Works facility. There was a lot of discussion about PrAC taking a stance on having the upper portion of the area that Public Works wanted to expand into, and they are currently using for some purposes, included as part of Waterboard Park. The PrAC decided not to take an action during this sitting commission's time, but introduce it into the goal setting session of the next year to do that. It says nothing about how Public Works might use the property it has down along Washington Street. Along
Center.
Center Street. It's just on the upper portion. And
So it is going forward or not?
the PrACs decided to not give a formal statement. They want, first of all, things to be clearly delineated. So they did not make a decision at the last meeting and basically are holding off until the next year.
So, what do you mean Parks or Public Works got something on First Street?
They bought industrial property to expand.
Morgan's Distributing, right?
I think that's right, yeah.
So
Which was equal to acreage of what they, what their plans were here.
Yeah.
And it's actually, it's probably going to be cheaper because they would have had to install an elevator to connect the upper portion to the lower portion. So it actually is a cheaper fit. So, and that's something, whether the Natural Resource Committee wants to put that as a discussion point with PrAC or not.
I think we should, only because Waterward Park is an idea. Natural resource area and
Yes, it is.
possible designation.
So the thing is, if we're going to do a joint session, we'll probably have to have some items on it. This is one that occurs to me right offhand.
Right.
Yeah, and just looking back, it was July 27th last year that we had the meeting, and the discussion items included funding for invasive species removal in city parks, which parks have the natural resource overlay district, stormwater runoff and quality in city parks, additions of natural areas to city parks, which is the Waterboard Park issue, heritage tree designations in city parks, funding for heritage tree designation arborist reports in city parks, and insecticide use in city parks.
Yeah, I think if we arrange it this year, because if we want to push for an arborist to be contracted with the city, and they don't have an arborist, that would have to go into their next budget cycle. And whether if PrAC and the NRC could come forward to their goal-setting session and put this forward as a recommendation, that would probably be an apropos thing to do. And to have the meeting, we might have turnover next year in terms of our respective committees, probably would have. But the point is to actually start the ball rolling before next year. So is that okay?
Yes.
Yeah, I think it'd be a real good idea. I'm glad you brought that up.
Can you give us an update? I understood PrAC asked that the settlement from the removal of tree
Yes.
tops
Yes.
was asked to be put into the park fund? Or-
No, it was asked to be specifically directed to Waterboard Park
Okay,
as opposed to
general fund or what?
Well, the money would probably go to parks in general. The focus, they wanted to be all going to Waterboard Park.
So they made the recommendation.
Yeah.
PrAC, good.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it help for us to make that recommendation too? Or is it needed?
Well, no, you can make a motion, we can vote on it. Just maybe put the motion to support PrAC's recommendation to actually have all of the settlement funds directed towards Waterford. And phrase your motion so that they can pick up the motion from PrAC and actually use that same language.
Okay.
You want to put that forward, that?
Then I move that the Natural Resources Committee, following the initial work of PrAC, concurs with the designation of funds from a recent settlement for removal of trees flow on to Waterboard Park, enhancement and possible designation.
Just Waterboard Park.
Waterboard Park.
Rather going to DK. I phrase it so that we adopt the language of the PrAC.
And that we adopt the language of, that has been promulgated by PrAC.
Right. Did you hear a second?
A second.
All in favor, say aye. Aye. And then there was, all four said aye, so. Okay,
Good.
Great.
Good deal. Wow.
Yeah.
I feel good now.
Yeah.
How much money was it from the
So I
settlement?
actually, a good portion of that went to the attorneys.
Is that right?
Yes, and so it was, I would say in the neighborhood of 150,000. So it wasn't that much money. And then the areas that got distributed in general in the park fund, just get diluted in the process. So it wasn't a huge amount of money.
All right. Well, 160 is good. Good start.
Well, that's not what the city was seeking. And they were seeking more than that. That's not what they got.
Oh,
Okay, anything else for the good of the order? Hearing none?
good deal.
Sure.
Good deal.